Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and demystify this somewhat complex world of government borrowing. We hear about national debt all the time in the news, right? But how often do we actually stop to understand the mechanics behind it? Well, today we're going to break down exactly how governments finance their operations, using some very clear, structured concepts to guide us.
Now, you might be wondering, is national debt just like your personal credit card bill? A lot of us assume government borrowing works exactly like our personal mortgages or car loans. But that is a massive misconception we are definitely going to clear up today. It is incredibly tempting to look at a country's balance sheet through the lens of our own household budgets. But as you'll see, the rules of the game are just entirely different when you're a sovereign state.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. Decoding public debt, 2. Public versus private borrowing, 3. Short-term floating debt, 4. Medium-term government loans, 5. Long-term national projects, and finally, 6. The public debt ecosystem.
Let's start with Section 1, Decoding Public Debt.
To really get this, let's look at the strict economic meaning. Economist Finlay Schreius completely hit the nail on the head when he said, national debt is a debt which a state owes to its own subjects or to the nationals of other countries. Why do they do this? Simply because their expenditure exceeds their revenue. Unlike standard taxes or fees, which, never have to be repaid, public debt is a totally unique source of government revenue. The state is strictly obligated to pay back the principal amount along with interest. They take on these loans to build the country, cover budget deficits, fund massive infrastructure, or even run public welfare schemes.
Moving on to Section 2, Public versus Private Borrowing.
This perfectly illustrates why we literally cannot compare the state's massive finances to our own household budgets. Imagine if you could just completely refuse to pay a loan without facing legal action, or, say, force your neighbor to lend you cash. No way, you absolutely can't. But under abnormal circumstances, a government actually can. The state has the power of compulsion. They can legally force people or institutions to lend them funds. Plus, under extreme conditions, a government can repudiate, meaning they just refuse to pay back its loans. A private individual would immediately face legal action for that. And the core motivation is just entirely different. Private debt is usually all about profit, whereas public debt is fundamentally raised for the welfare of society. On top of that, because they have such high creditworthiness, a government can borrow at much lower interest rates. They can even unilaterally reduce those rates during a financial crisis. Private borrowers, like you and me, simply have to accept the higher rates dictated by the market, due to the risk we pose to lenders. All right, Section 3, Short-term floating debt. For this part, I want you to think of me as your economics lecturer, walking you step by step through the absolute core of our explainer, the maturity timeline. Here are the 3 main time horizons governments use to borrow funds. We start on the far left with short-term obligations, move into the medium term, and then stretch way out into the long term. Let's break down that first category right now. Starting on the short end, we have what's known as floating debt. When we talk about short-term public debt, the maturity period is strictly up to 1 year. These are rapid-fire financial instruments specifically designed to be issued and completely paid off within that single year. To actually execute this, governments use very specific financial instruments, most notably things like treasury bills and treasury-guaranteed bonds. Because they are so incredibly brief, think of a treasury bill that might only last 3 to 6 months, these are often classified as unfunded debts. That basically means the government doesn't even bother setting aside a dedicated long-term fund just to pay them back. It's a quick, short-term mechanism designed to smooth over temporary cash flow issues. You wouldn't use this to build a new highway, for instance. Now for Section 4, Medium-term government loans. Step 2 on our maturity timeline is the medium term. This refers to government debts with a maturity timeline ranging anywhere from 1 to 5 years. It acts as a really vital transitional bridge. It gives the state some much-needed financial breathing room beyond a single fiscal year, but without locking them into decade-long obligations. It's absolutely perfect for projects or economic stabilization efforts that just need more than a few months to resolve. Which brings us to Section 5, Long-term national projects. Finally, we reach the heavy lifters of the government balance sheet. Long-term public debt involves borrowing for durations of more than 5 years. The explicit purpose here? It is used to finance major, multi-generational national development projects and massive capital infrastructure that will shape the country's future. Now, what is genuinely fascinating is how these long-term debts are judged. If the loan built a real way, it's considered productive and essentially pays for itself.
Productive debts yield income, so think irrigation, power projects, or heavy industries like steel. The revenue generated actually pays off the interest and the principal. But if the debt funds a war or just covers budgetary deficits, it is considered an unproductive dead weight. It adds absolutely nothing to the productive capacity of the economy and becomes a total drain on resources.
To manage these massive long-term debts safely, governments create what are called funded debts. This means they create a specific debt fund and carefully deposit money into it every single year to prepare for the eventual repayment date. Unlike those short-term unfunded treasury bills we discussed a minute ago, long-term borrowing requires incredibly strict discipline. This dedicated fund ensures that when the bill finally comes due in 10 or 20 years, the cash is just sitting there waiting to clear the obligation.
And to actually afford these mega projects, governments must make a massive choice. Do they borrow internally from their own domestic citizens and institutions, or externally from foreign entities like the IMF or World Bank? Internal debt keeps the national income the exact same. The money just sort of moves around inside the country. But external debt? That means the payment of interest actually transfers a part of the country's national income abroad, which actively reduces the wealth of the debtor country. Let's wrap things up with Section 6, the public debt ecosystem. Looking at this overarching framework, you can see how all these concepts interlock. A single debt can be long-term, funded, external, and productive, all at the exact same time. This is the complete public debt ecosystem that economists use to analyze a nation's financial health, perfectly categorizing everything from that maturity timeline we just walked through to productive versus unproductive uses. And here is a wild concept to wrap your head around regarding voluntariness. While most of these debts are voluntary, meaning citizens willingly subscribe to government loans, a government can actually force compulsory debts. During extreme emergencies, like a major war or severe inflation, the state can exert its power to forcibly take loans from the public. This is done to deliberately pull cash out of the economy, reducing the purchasing power in your hands to cool things down. So, what does all of this mean for you? I really want you to leave this explainer with one crucial thought. If you looked at your own government's balance sheet right now, how are they leveraging this maturity timeline today? Which of these classifications holds the most weight? Are they investing in a productive future or just piling on unproductive burdens? Understanding these concepts gives you the power to look right past the political talking points and see the actual mechanics of your nation's economy. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the numbers behind the news.